Greetings to all our today's guest, Uriel Epshtein, the Chief Executive Officer of the Renewed Democracy Initiative. We're glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
The report of ISW referenced a statement by Russian President Vladimir Putin at the naval parade in St. Petersburg, where he claimed that if the U.S. deploys long-range missile systems in Germany by 2026, the flight time to Russian industrial and defense targets would be around 10 minutes. The dictator also promised to take mirror measures and withdraw Russia from the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Do you agree that Putin is falsely trying to present the Russian deployment of missiles previously banned under the INF Treaty as an inflection, likely as part of his repeated efforts to use nuclear saber rattling to push the West to self-deter?
Of course, it's Putin's strategy is to do whatever he can to try to intimidate the West through these threats or to try to market Russian aggression, to try to market Russian escalation as a response to something that the West is doing. And this is something, he's been doing for years. This didn't just begin, by the way, in 2022. This has been happening for decades, even prior to this. And the single greatest weakness, as I see it on behalf of Western governments, is often giving in to this type of brinksmanship by the Russian dictator. The truth is that Putin is a dog with a very, very loud bark, but his bite isn't anywhere near as powerful as his bark. Although, of course, it's a bite that the Ukrainian people have felt fairly significantly over the course of the last few years. And so my hope is that right now, Western governments, the governments in Europe, the American government, will not once again give in to these Russian threats, because what we've seen is that every time we give in to one of these threats, Putin escalates further, right? And we've seen this, by the way, over the course of the last 20 years. So beginning in 2000, Putin bombed Chechnya into the ground, and the West did not even respond, barely responded. In 2008, he went into Georgia, and again, no response by the West. In 2014, he took Crimea by force. The West barely responded. In 2020, he went into Belarus in order to save dictator Lukashenko. The West barely responded. And then in 2021, he did the same exact thing in Kazakhstan. So at that point, it was fairly logical, in my view, that Putin would think, okay, if I go into Ukraine and take all of Ukraine by force, or try to do so, the West will be unlikely to respond. And of course, this was thankfully a significant miscalculation by Putin, but I think it's exactly Western weakness that led to the invasion, the full-scale invasion of 2022. Meanwhile, every single time the West stood up to Putin's threats, refused to back down in the face of his saber rattling, Putin himself had no choice but to back down. And again, we saw this time and time again since the full-scale invasion. Originally, we could not give Ukraine heavy weaponry. HIMARS were a bridge too far. But of course, as soon as we gave Ukraine HIMARS, it changed the calculus on the battlefield, and Putin did absolutely nothing because he had no choice. Then we provided tanks. Prior to that, tanks were a red line. No. Tanks are an aggressive weapon. That's a red line for Putin. We cannot do it. But of course, once we gave Ukraine tanks, Putin did nothing because he could not do anything. And last but not least, Putin said that he started this entire war but because of the threat of NATO on Russia's borders. He said he could not allow Ukraine to join NATO because that would be too significant a border between Russia and NATO. But then when Finland and Sweden ultimately joined NATO, thereby doubling Russia's border with NATO, Putin did exactly nothing. And in fact, when asked about it by journalists, he said that this does not concern him and it is the sovereign right of Finland and Sweden to do what they please. And he responded that way because, again, he had no choice. Putin is not a man who wants to lose. He's not someone who wants to risk his life or the life of his mafia in order to try to do some doomed quest of standing up to the West. What he wants to do and what he's willing to do is to pressure us so long as we continue to retreat. But as soon as we stand our ground, what I think we found is that Putin is unable or unwilling to respond.
Uriel, about next article, Russia complained to the United States about Ukrainians' alleged preparation of covert of a covert operation, Washington asked Kyiv to to restrain reports. The New York Times, it is unclear whether there was any real preparation for the operation and what form it could have taken. Representatives of the Pentagon and the White House say nothing has happened yet, but they refuse to disclose the details of the conversation. How do you assess such conduct between the U.S. and the Kremlin?
So I can't speak to the specific covert operation that the Russians were saying that the Ukrainians were planning. I mean, we've seen a number, I think, of operations that Ukrainians have been able to successfully conclude behind enemy lines in Russia. So I'll say two things. First, I think it's a good thing, ultimately, for the Russians and the Americans to have direct communication, right? We ultimately do not want a mistake or something like that to lead to actual nuclear escalation, although I believe that nuclear escalation is far less likely than what we hear in the news. Again, I don't think Putin is suicidal. I don't think his generals and admirals, all of whom are either millionaires or billionaires, I don't think they are suicidal. So I think the likelihood of an actual nuclear conflict is incredibly minimal. But nevertheless, we want to continue to keep that risk low. So therefore, having deconfliction communication between the Americans and the Russians is important. What I think we saw in this instance, which is unusual, is that it's the Russians who reached out to the Americans. In the last, I think, almost all of the previous connections between the respective heads of the military of either of the two countries, it's been almost always the Americans reaching out to the Russians. So the fact that they reached out to us right now, I think that's an interesting piece of information. And one of the things that, to me at least, it's starting to tell me is that the Russians may not be in as strong a position as we previously assumed that they were. But the other piece here, and this again is a piece of advice that I want to offer to the Americans and to Western governments, is that we cannot keep trying to tie the hands of the Ukrainian government for fear of this kind of escalation. I mean, for instance, in that New York Times article which you cited, they also referenced that the Americans were discouraging Ukrainians from attacking the Kerch Bridge. The Ukrainians famously attacked the Kerch Bridge twice, leading to significant damage and thereby significantly disrupting Russian abilities to supply their troops in Crimea and in other parts of Ukraine. The Kerch Bridge was an obvious military target for Ukraine. It was a legitimate military target, and it's no surprise that Ukraine tried to take it out. And in fact, if the Americans were to give the Ukrainians the means by which to actually fully destroy the Kerch Bridge, then the Russian position in Crimea would become much more difficult, because we have to remember that Crimea is a peninsula. Therefore, the Russians can only supply Crimea in two ways, either through this Kerch Bridge or through the land bridge of land that they conquered in the south of Ukraine. Those are the only two ways in which the Russians can supply Crimea. That means that their forces in Crimea are incredibly vulnerable. And if if the Ukrainians are able to take out one of these two, or ideally both of these bridges, then the Russian position in that place becomes entirely untenable. And actually, Ukraine may well be able to take back additional territory to the south. So the fact that the Americans have continued to try to prevent the Ukrainian government from taking these steps is something that's incredibly concerning to me. And it's something also that flies in the face of historical evidence, right? Every single one of these times that I listed earlier, where the Americans were concerned that some weapon or some action by the Ukrainians would be considered escalatory, it has proven, in fact, that it hasn't been escalatory because, number one, the Russians are unable to effectively respond, right, unless they're willing to actually have a direct conflict with the West, which I don't think they are. But two, they cannot respond. There is nothing more that the Russian government can do. They have tried everything. They have done everything. The only weapon left in Russia's arsenal that they haven't yet used are nuclear weapons. And again, for all the reasons that I've stated previously, I don't think the Russians are willing to escalate this to nuclear war. Mm-hmm.
Well, and we see that Ukrainian army attacked with tanks and airfield in Crimea and other objects and hope that breach in Crimea will blow. So let's talk about For example, about presidential race, Vice President Kamala Harris is enjoying a bounce in her favorability rating among Americans just days after President Joe Biden bowed out of the presidential race and endorsed her, according to an ABC News poll released Sunday. What do you think about rating in U.S. presidential race, about Trump and about Harris?
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to recognize the fact that Harris having replaced Biden significantly changes this race, right? After Biden's poor performance in the debate a few weeks ago, I think, the Biden's likelihood of being able to beat Trump plummeted. There was simply no way he could win against Trump by essentially having convincing Biden to resign the campaign, of course, not the presidency, but the campaign, and bringing in a candidate who is much younger, and one who has a significant prosecutorial background, right? She's someone who has been a prosecutor, who has gone after criminals, and therefore who knows how to be aggressive and how to do this. I think that has put the Trump campaign on its back foot. I mean, they were really expecting and I think hoping to run this campaign against Joe Biden, an old man who unfortunately is no longer in the prime of his life and therefore no longer capable of aggressively prosecuting the case against Donald Trump. Kamala Harris, however, is a completely different opponent, and one who is capable of making that case aggressively, and one whom also the Trump campaign is struggling to define, right? I mean, they're trying to attack her in ways by highlighting that she's a woman, that she's weak, that she's radical, etc. But all of these attacks have been ineffective so far. They have not been able to successfully define her. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign has discovered significant weaknesses of its own, because their chosen vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, made a number of comments that have alienated suburban women in America, right? He's talking about how some of these women are single, childless cat ladies and therefore should not be allowed to run the country. And when he made those comments, he specifically called out Kamala Harris. He specifically called out Pete Buttigieg, right, who is a member of the cabinet. And obviously he and his husband now do have children. But at the time that J.D. Vance made these comments, Pete Buttigieg was struggling to adopt. And that's a struggle that countless couples in the United States face. And so I think the Trump campaign has alienated a number of these people and have put themselves in a much weaker position. Now, as for the actual likelihood of who will win this election, I think it's a flip of a coin. I think we simply don't know right now. I think the election is totally up in the air, but right now it is 50-50. I think it's still possible for Trump to win, right? In fact, I still think Kamala Harris is the underdog here, right? She's only been in this campaign for 1 week. Donald Trump has been the front runner in this campaign for almost an entire year. And so it's going to take more than 1 good week for her to shift this balance and to take over the front runner status. So right now, I think it's roughly 50-50, although Trump still maintains the edge.
U.S. Democrats have spent recent days trying out a relatively new attack line on Donald Trump, that he is weird. Whether this tactic calibrated to resonate with young and independent voters who polls show, or now more engaged with election. Your reaction?
Well, one of the things that I think that the Trump campaign back in 2016 perfected is trolling. Right? They take these attacks, they use these attacks, and oftentimes the attacks themselves aren't serious. But that's not the point, because they end up driving the narrative, right? So each time Trump tries to come up with a nickname for whatever candidate he's attacking, right? It's Crooked Joe Biden, or it's Lion Ted Cruz. This was back in the Republican primaries. I actually don't remember what his current nickname is for Kamala Harris. But each time the Trump campaign has essentially tried to leverage trolling in order to have an edge against their opponents. Meanwhile, Democrats, and in general, other traditional opponents of Donald Trump, even within the Republican Party, are more traditional politicians. They generally try to have more traditional attacks. They might focus on elements of Trump's personal life, which are, of course, deeply problematic. I mean, this is a man who has slept with a porn star, who has had multiple wives, has cheated on all of them. And so there's certainly any elements of the personal life which Democrats could focus on. There's also, more importantly, much more importantly, are the attacks that Democrats would use against policy positions, right? They might talk about President Trump's sympathies to the Russian dictator, or President Trump's flip-flopping on Kim Jong-un, where he went from talking about how his nuclear button is bigger than Kim Jong-un's nuclear button, and then, of course, he immediately did a 180 and talked about how much he loved Kim Jong-un. So I think these new attack lines that you see the Kamala Harris campaign using, talking about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance as weird, and again, I don't necessarily want to direct your viewers to this, but if your viewers are interested, they can Google J.D. Vance and couches, and they'll see particular attacks around the connection between J.D. Vance and living room furniture. But I think these types of trolling is something the Democrats have actually learned from the Trump campaign. And I think for once, at least over the course of the last week, we're seeing Democrats using these tactics very effectively. And they are actually dominating a good portion of the social media conversation, even though I should note that Twitter today is owned by Elon Musk, who has aggressively come out in support of Donald Trump. So even though Elon Musk is undoubtedly putting his thumb on the scale of the Twitter platform to support Mr. Trump, despite that, I actually find a lot of these trolling attacks to have kind of dominated the Twitter platform over the course of the last few days. So it'll be very interesting whether they're able to maintain this momentum over the course of the next few weeks.
If we're talking about Elon Musk, Kamala Harris election campaign has accused Elon Musk of spreading manipulated lies after the Tesla chief executive posted a doctored video featuring the vice president of his X account. Musk reposted a manipulated Harris campaign video on Friday evening in which a fake Harris voiceover says, "I was selected because I'm the ultimate diversity hire, and that anyone who criticizes her as both sexist and racist." For what purpose? It's also like Russian propaganda or something like that?
Well, I think that's two different things. And I want to make sure that we don't conflate the two. So on the one hand, I think Elon Musk is going to be amplifying and posting this type of content with abandon. And I think we should continue to expect him to post these types of videos over the course of the next few weeks and months. It has been a common refrain of the right that Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate who is not ready, unprepared for the presidency, that she was unprepared for the vice presidency. I mean, I think that's a little bit ironic given the fact that J.D. Vance was only senator for a couple of years, and that prior to this, he had no serious experience outside of some venture capital experience and having graduated from Yale. So I find some of these attacks fall a little bit short. I also think it's a little bit ironic given the fact that Donald Trump himself, before having become president in 2016, had no government experience, had no military experience. His only experience was in business, after which he had 4 bankruptcies, I should note. And then his major success came as a result of his leadership of a TV show, The Apprentice TV show. But again, we find that some of these arguments around those kinds of experiences, again, will fall flat. Again, the Ukrainians themselves, you guys have seen this. President Zelensky's prior experience to becoming president was also in show business, and he has proven himself an incredibly capable wartime leader. So again, I think that Donald Trump is trying to use these attacks of Kamala as a DEI candidate. Elon Musk is amplifying those attacks of her as a DEI candidate merely because they will, I think, anger elements of the right-wing base, some of which I think is motivated by racism, some of which I don't think is motivated by racism. I think it's motivated by genuine concern of how racial identity has become a very significant component of political discourse in the U.S. in ways that I don't think are productive, right? And I've made this point to a number of my friends on the left that I don't think either side should be focused on identity-driven concerns of candidates, because that's something you can't control, right? So when you talk about someone, whether it's Kamala Harris or someone else, and you primarily characterize that person as a Black woman or by whatever identity that that person has, you're really characterizing them by circumstances of their birth, which they cannot control. And one of the things that I have actually been fairly impressed by the Harris campaign is that right now they are not actually focusing on these elements of Harris's candidacy. I've heard that they're much more focused on highlighting elements of her experience as a former prosecutor, someone who spent a good portion of her career going after criminals. They're talking about obviously about her experience as a senator and then her experience as the vice president of the United States. Meanwhile, it's the Trump camp, which is actually focused on some of these identity-driven arguments. But you made an interesting point in your question earlier on when you asked whether or not this is akin to Russian propaganda. And this is something that the Russians have become incredibly good at. Russians don't create arguments. They don't create the new positions within the U.S. society. What they do is they amplify existing divisions in the free world. So what they'll do is they'll take an argument that has already been expressed by, some individual, whether that person usually is on the far right or the far left. They'll take extremists from either side, and then they will amplify the arguments of those extremists in ways that would not naturally happen in our society. Ultimately, the number of people in America that I would consider to be politically extremist is a fairly small percentage. But what the Putin government is effectively able to do is it's able to make it appear like those extremists are much more powerful and have more support than they actually do. And that in turn drives a lot of the American discourse in ways that I do believe are damaging to our democracy. So what we need to be on the lookout for are two things. One, it's the actual arguments themselves, right? We need to, I think, reject the arguments from political extremes that try to focus only on people's identity, whether it's racial, ethnic, sexual, or whatever else. I think we ultimately need to reject a lot of those arguments and focus on people's experiences and positions rather than on the circumstances of their birth. And then number two, we need to be on the lookout for when foreign dictatorial regimes try to take advantage of our divisions in order to further attack our own democracies. We need to ultimately try to put a stop to people like Putin trying to take advantage of our freedoms in order to use them against us.
About Trump, the U.S. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump delivered a keynote to crypto advocates at the Bitcoin 2024 conference. The former U.S. president promised to make the United States the crypto capital of the planet and Bitcoin superpower of the world. Positioning himself as a contrast to the Biden administration and the Democratic nominee Kamala Harris, Trump pledged to create a Bitcoin strategic reserve for the U.S. government. Is it true that Bitcoin price hit 6-week high after Trump backs cryptocurrency? How its effects on voters?
Yeah, I think this is a perfect example of Trump making the same mistake that Democrats made in 2016. In 2016, I think a lot of the top operatives in the Democratic Party assumed that the online world, Twitter, represented real life. Right. And so they thought that a lot of positions on Twitter were actually majority positions that the majority of Americans held, which, of course, proved to be wrong. Right. And so when in 2016 and 2020, Democrats actually listened to a lot of the people on Twitter who were expressing fairly far left positions, and then they assumed some of those positions, they were punished for it at the polls. Right. Where the majority of Americans were not on board with what appeared to be a left wing consensus on Twitter. And I think what you're seeing today with this new Bitcoin element is the same exact mistake, except this time it's coming from the right, where you see a lot of these folks adopting this super online discourse around the importance of cryptocurrency and the central role that cryptocurrency will play in the economy in the future. For the record, I am not against cryptocurrency. I have no problem with cryptocurrency. I think it's a very interesting new technology that may well have an important role to play in our economy. The only argument that I am making here is that the vast majority of Americans don't know anything about, nor do they care about cryptocurrency or Bitcoins. And so the fact that Donald Trump is making this argument about making America the Bitcoin capital of the world, I think that's an argument that is meant to cater to people like David Sachs, people like Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, and so forth. And it is not meant to cater to the vast majority of Americans. And I think that it's perfectly possible possible that working class people in the Midwest who have never maybe even heard of Bitcoin may well punish Donald Trump for it at the polls. Again, this is a descriptive prediction and not a normative one. I have no opinion one way or another as to the value of some of this cryptocurrency. But I do think it's worth noting, like you said, that immediately after Donald Trump's pronouncement, Bitcoin immediately increased in price. So I do think it's worth asking the question of who benefits from this newfound embrace by Donald Trump of this type of cryptocurrency.
Former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has outlined what Donald Trump's peace plan might look like if he wins the presidential election. It involves increasing military aid to Ukraine and its membership in the European Union and NATO. Pompeo said in his OPD in the Wall Street Journal that there is no evidence that Trump, if elected president, would push Ukraine towards capitulation. Do you believe in this peace plan?
Well, I believe in the peace plan in the sense that I think it's great. I mean, I think what Mike Pompeo wrote is fantastic. I just think that the audience for that piece is not the general public. It's not, all these different folks. The audience, the intended audience of the Wall Street Journal piece that Mike Pompeo wrote is an audience of one. The only person who Mike Pompeo hoped would read that piece is Donald Trump himself. This is the peace plan that Mike Pompeo laid out in that piece is not Donald Trump's peace plan. Not even close, not even remotely close. What Mike Pompeo, I believe, again, I don't know the man, I believe that this is his goal, is to try to convince Donald Trump to adopt something along those lines as his plan for Ukraine. The likelihood, I believe the likelihood of success is next to zero. I do not think it is likely that Donald Trump will adopt anything of what Mike Pompeo said in that piece as his plan for Ukraine. And I think there is more than enough evidence that Donald Trump will adopt the exact opposite and that he may well push for some form of capitulation on the part of Ukraine. And the evidence of that, first and foremost, is in Donald Trump's choice of running mate. J.D. Vance is on video as having said numerous times that he, quote, does not care about Ukraine, that he just simply doesn't care about it. Meanwhile, one of J.D. Vance's key allies in the U.S. Congress is a congressman by the name of Matt Gaetz. And Matt Gaetz has publicly considered that perhaps it's not Ukraine who should be joining NATO, but rather Russia who should be joining NATO. Now, of course, these are not serious arguments, just as I believe that Matt Gaetz is not a serious person. But these are arguments that are genuinely popular in the far-right bubble in which J.D. Vance and Matt Gaetz live. So since Donald Trump chose J.D. Vance as his running mate, instead of a more traditional Republican candidate like, say, Governor Burgum, or perhaps even Nikki Haley, although I never believed that Donald Trump would choose Nikki Haley, I think indicates the direction in which Donald Trump is headed in terms of foreign policy. I do not think Donald Trump will do any of the things that Mike Pompeo said. I think it's far more likely that Donald Trump will follow the advice of David Sachs, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk,